I know you mentioned there too about having the scars on your face and on your body and being. I did an interview a while back with Jason Schechterly, who was
Yeah.
another guy that was burned very severely as a police officer, and I was
Yep.
asking him about how that, like, I know because kids, they could be very questionable about this stuff, especially see somebody with no arm or they see some kind of scars. They even question. Does that happen when you're out with your daughter? Do you get that from people like that, like especially kids or any of her friends that say, "Hey, what's going on with your dad here?" And how do you kind of respond to that?
Well, there's a couple different ways I respond to it. It depends on the child. But my daughter definitely notices it. She'll have kids that go to her school and they'll ask her a question about what happened to your dad, right? And she'll, just kind of pridefully just say he served in the military and he was injured in the military. And they're like, oh wow, that's cool, right? Like especially like the young boys are like, that's cool. I think my approach to children is very different, right? Like I'll have a child that is staring at me, and I had a kid one time coming up to me and said, "You don't look normal." And I remember telling him, I was like, "Well, that's funny because I was looking at you thinking the same exact thing." And he was like, "What do you mean? I look normal." I was like, "No, you're not. I'm normal." He's like, "No, I'm normal." And it's just like it blew his mind. And so I use humor as a way to sort of debunk. I had a kid one time when my daughter was in taekwondo around 5 years old. His name is Peter. He would always come up to me and he'd be like, "What happened to your ear?" Just like that, callous, what happened to your ear? And I was like, "Oh, Peter, I lost it. Can I borrow yours?" And he'd be like, "No," run away laughing, right? And so I use humor as a way to sort of break down that awkwardness that children have and that curiosity. And let's kind of get to the root of where you can see me as a big jokester, a big kid, because that's essentially what I am. And what I'll do is if I see kids that are staring at me, but aren't, they're being polite, but they're staring at me, I purposely, depending on where I am, I'll purposely kind of walk over and be like, "How you doing? Hey, what's going on?" If they're doing something, I'm like, "Oh, so tell me about that. What's this?" I'll immediately like, "Hey, let's take the attention off of what you're focusing on. Let's connect on a human level." And for me, it's all about hopefully equipping them that the next time they interact with somebody that is similar to me, that they don't have, it kind of removes that stage of like figuring it out. They could just kind of jump into like, "Oh, that's a person." Because I remember meeting this other person that looked a certain way, and I realized that they're just a person too.
What's doing, everybody? I'm Alec Lace. Thank you for watching First Class Fatherhood. Today's guest on the podcast is J.R. Martinez. J.R. is a United States Army veteran who was severely wounded in Iraq when a Humvee that he was driving hit an IED. The resulting explosion left him with burns to more than 30% of his body. He's had multiple surgeries and skin grafts, but that did not stop this American hero from becoming successful. As an actor, he has starred on All My Children, and despite having to relearn how to walk, he took home the crown on Dancing with the Stars in season 13. He's such an inspiration. He's a motivational speaker right now. I'm honored to have him on the podcast. Get down there, hit the subscribe button, tap the like, and let's jump into it right now with J.R. Martinez on First Class Fatherhood. Joining me now, First Class Father J.R. Martinez. Welcome to First Class Fatherhood.
Hey, appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's jump right into it here. How many kids do you have and how old are they?
I would normally say 4, but there's going to be a lot of people listening right now that be like, "Wait a minute, I thought he had 2." Well, I have 2 fur ones too, and I really consider them to be my kids, but I have 2 human. I have a 9-year-old daughter and I have a 4-month-old son. So I'm starting this thing all over again, man. And it's so true that when they say you kind of forget, right? And what the process was like, but let me tell you this. So our 9-year-old we have a daughter, and then our son is 4 months old. But before our son was born, my wife and I were like, maybe we'll go after another one. Yeah, maybe we're good. We're good. We're good.
So
Like
you're not gonna try to break the tie.
No, 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 no. We're good. Like I can have her. We each can have a hand on one of them, and and more than likely, the way it's going to work, we can already see it, even though he's only 4 months old, that my wife and I both will have hands on the son. Our daughter is like so mature and such an adult that she's going to be like fine and functioning and doing her thing. We're both going to have to be all hands on deck with this guy, because he is such a happy baby. But he needs a little bit of work. He needs a little bit more work than our daughter needed.
I would imagine so. All right, sounds like it. If you could, JR, please take a minute here to hit my listeners with a little bit about your background and what you do.
So this big story about me is I served in the military. I was deployed to Iraq in early 2003 during the invasion. I was injured overseas in Iraq. I came back at the age of 19 years old. Essentially had experienced burns to over 34% of my body and had to get out of the military. I was not allowed to stay in. Was able to somewhat piece it together. Although the physical recovery was challenging, it was more of the mental, the emotional recovery that was incredibly challenging for me. But I was able to go into this space of becoming a speaker, getting into the philanthropy space and helping veterans and being an advocate on behalf of veterans and their family members. And then I got into the entertainment space and I got on All My Children. And then from that, it led to going on Dancing with the Stars. And then I've had the opportunity to write a book and travel all over the country, all over the world to talk about life and my story and my experiences. And it's been a blessing, man. But right now, I still am a speaker, but I'm going to college right now and just kind of just furthering my education and just focus on the family.
Well said. Yeah. Well, your success is well deserved, and your voice is definitely needed right now too. So, props to you, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
your service, of course.
I
And,
appreciate that, man.
and so you said 9 years old, your daughter. Then, so about how old were you then when you first became a dad, and how did that experience change your perspective on life?
I was 28 years old when my daughter was born, and I could tell you one of the biggest lessons, the early lessons my daughter taught me was even though I really talked about being present, I think one of the biggest first indicators where I realized time, I mean, how it flies by, especially with an infant, is when my daughter was a baby. I was so busy. I would be on the road for 2 weeks at a time and bouncing around for 2 weeks, and then I'd come home, and the baby that I left 2 weeks ago was completely different. And I just remember realizing, like, oh my God, I have to enjoy this time that I have with her because it's going to fly by so fast. And so every time that I started to be with her, I would put my phone down, right? I would tell everybody, hey, listen, I'm going to be, MIA for the next few hours while before she has to go to bed or whatever the case may be, or wherever my next commitment was. And that was one of the first things that it taught me, she taught me, was be present. And that's something that I still do with her today. I mean, even though she's 9 years old, when she's talking, I'm like looking at her. I put down my phone. I make an effort to like not be engaged in nothing else and just really listen to her and have conversation with her. And it was one of those important lessons for me in life because even though I understood that this moment was valuable, I'd kind of got sucked into the pressures of you gotta do X amount of events a year. You gotta make X amount of money a year. You gotta take this on. And I just sort of kind of got away from like, hey man, less is more. And I just got caught up in this more mindset, but in many cases it's less. And so she taught me to slow down a little bit and make time for yourself and be present.
Yeah, great stuff, JR. And one of the many reasons why I love, the men and women of our military, and I bring so many dads from the service on here, is because I can't even, it's unimaginable to me for so many of these guys that are away overseas for a year and they miss out on that time. And like you said, just
Yeah.
for a couple of days, you can come back and there's so many
Yeah.
different changes. So I can't even begin to imagine what that's like for them.
Yeah, I've had moments. I remember about 2 years ago. So my daughter was 7 years old. I was getting ready to leave on a trip, and I remember pulling out of the driveway, and I saw my daughter standing on the stairs, and she's waving at me. She's waving by, and dude, I just started bawling. I just started bawling as I was driving away. And then I stopped and I thought about all those service members, all those individuals that have children at home, young children especially, and having to leave them for a deployment for training for extended period of time. And I just thought it just one of those perspective moments where I just really appreciated our military for the sacrifices and putting themselves and their families through that experience. And it made me kind of feel like, well, hell, if they can do it, I think I can muster up the courage to just kind of manage for a few days.
Yeah, I'm right there with you because, like I said, I'll work on. I work for the railroad, and I'll go on like a 16-hour shift, and I'll get that way. And it's like here
Yeah,
it is. Then I can put it in perspective of like, you know what? I know I'm coming home tonight. You know what I mean? When this is over, I
right.
know I'm going to be home. There ain't no grave danger I'm putting myself in like these guys are doing as well. So, listen, I don't think we'd stand the chance in this world without you guys. So that's why
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
always
thank you, man.
always fortunate for it. So let me ask you this: you have a 4-month-old, so that means you had your child during this pandemic thing that's been going on. What was the differences between having your child now as opposed to having your daughter? Were you able to go to all the appointments, be in the room? Any complications whatsoever with that?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to where I was able to be at the hospital. I'm able to go to the appointments and do it. I think the biggest challenge for us having a baby during the pandemic is, how much you allow your, other people to come into your space and to hold your baby and want to see your baby. We got friends, we got family members that are so eager to hold him and to love up on him, but then we're like protective because even though my wife is vaccinated, we're like, how much of the antibodies are getting into him through nursing. And, there's just COVID is just this weird thing that nobody really understands. We just know it's a thing. We know it's still lingering. We just don't necessarily understand how it affects and who it affects. And so we're just, being very cautious of, okay, let's sort of isolate him. And in turn, what that means is we sort of isolate ourselves versus with our daughter. We were like, here's the world. We're going to go here. We're going to go there. We're going to expose you to this. Everybody was holding her. I remember when she was born, my mother-in-law couldn't make it because it was my sister-in-law's 21st birthday. And I was, I get it. It was very important to be there for that. So she flew in a couple days later. But we had my mother there and one of my wife and I's bosses who had become a dear, dear friend. And yet there was what, one, two, three other people in the room. Yet with my son, it was like only the father. That's it. My daughter couldn't even make it into the room to come and hold him and see him. Like we're standing out on the window, like, literally holding him up in the window. And she's like right there underneath the window, waving and looking at him. I mean, FaceTiming was the closest she can get to him and to see features. So it's created its own challenges, man, for sure, where we're like, man, listen, this is one of those things that we don't like about it, where it's separating us from the people that we would want to be around right now.
Yeah, and I think it went both ways too, with births and with deaths, because we've seen a lot of families that had to bury loved ones. They weren't even allowed to be in the room when they died. They could only have a few people at the funeral. So
exactly.
I mean, just as some of the things you don't think about unless they are affecting you. So that's why
exactly.
you went through it there with having the child. So how is your daughter taking to being the big sister? How has that been suiting her?
Oh my God, man. I mean, she cried when we told her that, we were expecting. She cried because she secretly wanted a brother, and she cried because we didn't find out the sex. We didn't find out the sex until he was actually born. There's a video I have of where the doctor, holds him up. You hear crying. She holds him up. She's like, all right, J.R., you can look. And I remember looking and I was like, for a second, there's a lot to kind of, process and work through. And I just remember just kind of like in the video, I'm kind of doing this dodging thing and really trying to make sure what I'm seeing is what I'm seeing. And then I was like, it's a boy. And so when we FaceTimed our daughter and we were like, and we had two names picked out, right? A boy name and a girl name. And when we said, meet Leo, I mean, she started, choking up. You can see little tears in her eyes. But man, she has been an incredible big sister, and we just always wants to hold him. She gets up in the morning, get ready to take her to school, and she's up. She's 15, 20 minutes early, and she's like, he's awake because he's nursing, and she's like, can I hold him? And before I go to school, I mean, we couldn't have asked for a better big sister. And I told my wife jokingly, I was like, if this dude if I ever hear him say to his sister, I hate you, you're the worst, I'm going to snatch him up, man. I'm going to snatch him up, because he has no idea how lucky he is to have her as his big sister, because she's going to look after him. And she already does. I mean, she said to my wife the other day, she said, Mommy, like, remember when what you and Daddy said that after I was born, how you love something so much, and she was like, yeah, and she was like, I understand it now. And it's just like one of those moments where you're like, you could, I mean, that as a parent, man, that's what you want. That's what you hope for your children, to get along and to love each other in that capacity. And we didn't have to do much, man. We're blessed with a great kid.
Yeah, that's awesome. I got 4 kids myself, and I can use a little bit of that love between my my oldest son and my youngest son. I can tell you that. So We're trying to find that balance right there. But I got to ask, what does your daughter think? From watching I don't know, what year did you win the Dancing with the Stars? Was she around when that
Uh,
happened or no?
no, so my wife was pregnant with her, and
Okay.
so now she's at the stage now where people will come up to us. I mean, this is a few years ago. People would come up to us when she was 4 or 5 years old, and they would, say, "Oh, I saw you on the show," and so she started watching it. But now, being 9 years old, she's ever more present. So she's like, she has these moments where I catch her, watching stuff on her phone. She's watching my routines, and when I was on Dancing with the Stars, and so it's pretty surreal because it's like, I was on it when that video you're watching, when I was doing that, you were in mommy's belly and now you're here watching it. It's one of those moments, right? And so, but for her, it's one of those things that it's surreal because it really, I mean, and even for me, sometimes now it feels like it was another life when I competed on that show, and I mean, 10 years ago. I tell you what, if people ask me right now, would you go on that show if they did like an all-star season? And I said, yeah, I totally would. However, the results are going to be completely different. It's going to look completely different now because I don't know about you, man, but I'm only 38 years old. But 28 to 38, that's a big jump. And physically, my body is in a very different place. Like my back is hurting right now, and I'm just sitting here. I didn't even do anything. I'm just like literally swiveling in this chair, and my back is hurting right now. So it would be a different experience.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've had a lot of dads on the show that have competed on Dancing with the Stars. I've had Donny Osmond on here that's won the show before. I had Maxim Chimerkovsky, who was one of the professional dancers. So everybody that I've talked to has really, really enjoyed their experience with the show. Is that what happened with you? What was your experience like?
Oh
like
man, I
being on
loved
there?
it. I loved it. I think for me, one of the biggest things that I think gave me a little bit, there's two things that I believe gave me an advantage. One, I was in shape. Before I went on the show, I was in decent shape. So I could put in a certain amount of hours of rehearsal, and I didn't feel winded. I was like, okay, I'm good. And so it gave me an advantage to where instead of me having to be like, oh, I got to take a day off or take a few hours off, I was like, no, let's keep going. Let me learn the routine. I'll come back tomorrow. We're going to rehearse again. Right. So that was one advantage. The second advantage I think it really gave me was, as a male contestant, you go on that show, you're taken out of your space where you are an expert, right? And you go into a space that you're not the expert. And the pro dancer, in this case, the female, is the expert. And I had Karina Smirnoff, man. Let me tell you something about Karina. She is an exceptional dancer, but she's also tough as hell. And she would like, get the routine, come on, and whatever. And I'm like, I'm trying. But I was able to sort of relinquish that ego, that pride, that power struggle of like, I don't need to be top dog. You're the top dog. You're teaching me. I'm here to learn. And I think that allowed me to have a very different experience. I think what also gave me an advantage, man, listen, I'm burned. My face has scars on it. My body has scars on it. My head has scars on it. Like, I'm not too sensitive about people telling me something about myself, right? Like, you got to develop a little bit of a tough skin, because if you don't, then you're always going to be hiding, because someone's always going to be looking at you or saying something. And so going on that show, when the judges would say, oh, that didn't look that good, it's like you're not a professional dancer. I'm like, oh no, like, really, like, I'm not. You're right, versus like Donnie's an entertainer, right? Like, so he sort of comes into it, even though he enjoyed it, but he comes into it possibly with a little bit of a sort of a thinking that I am an entertainer. I have a little bit of ability to dance. So if you tell me I'm not doing well, I'm going to take that a little bit more personal. I came into it with a clean slate. I'm like, yeah, surprise, I'm not a dancer. I knew that, you knew that, but I'm going to come back next week and I'm going to do better. And that's literally, I think, one of the advantages that it gave me over not only the other contestants that season, but I think if any contestant can sort of approach it that way, then I think you allow yourself to walk away at the end saying, oh, this was fun and I'll do it all over again.
Yeah, well said, JR. I'll tell you what, you got a lot of pressure on you now for that daddy-daughter dance when that shows up, because you got to show up when that happens. You can't be the champion of Dance with the Stars and be out there with the 2 feet shuffle. You got to come up with something.
we start coming up with or I have my daughter's arms and I swing her around. So we're doing like lifts, we're doing all sorts of stuff. We choreograph before the night of. I mean, we start putting stuff together, and then no one's watching though, because half the time my daughter's also like running off with their friends, so it's more just me hanging out with the dads in the back and be like, yeah, so how's work, man? So what's going on? Like what have you been up to, right? And then occasionally the kids come back around and they're like, okay, let's dance, let's dance. You do a couple twirls here and there, but no one's really paying attention. They just care about, can you do the baby shark song? Can you do the chicken dance? I mean, all the dancing stuff just goes out the window. Maybe when she becomes a teenager, maybe she'll care a little bit more. But right now, she's just like, oh, let's have fun doing the chicken dance and let me run around with my friends. That's what it is.
Very cool. And I know you mentioned there too about having the scars on your face and on your body. And being, I did an interview a while back with Jason Schechterly, who's
Yeah.
another guy that was burned very severely as a police officer. And I was
Yep.
asking him about how that, like, I know because kids, they could be very questionable about this stuff, especially see somebody with no arm or they see some kind of scars. They can question, does that happen when you're out with your daughter? Do you get that from people like that, like especially kids or any of her friends that say, hey, what's going on with your dad here? And how do you kind of respond to that?
Well, there's a couple different ways I respond to it. It depends on the child. But my daughter definitely notices it. She'll have kids that go to her school and they'll ask her a question about what happened to your dad, right? And she'll, just kind of pridefully just say he served in the military and he was injured in the military. And they're like, oh wow, that's cool, right? Like especially like the young boys are like, that's cool. But I think my approach to children is very different, right? Like I'll have a child that is staring at me, and I had a kid one time coming up to me and said, you don't look normal. And I remember telling him, I was like, well, that's funny because I was looking at you thinking the same exact thing. And he was like, what do you mean? I look normal. I was like, no, you're not. I'm normal. He's like, no, I'm normal. And it's just like it blew his mind. And so I use humor as a way to sort of debunk. I had a kid one time when my daughter was in taekwondo around 5 years old. His name is Peter. He would always come up to me and he'd be like, what happened to your ear? Just like that, callous, what happened to your ear? And I was like, oh, Peter, I lost it. Can I borrow yours? And he'd be like, no, run away laughing, right? And so I use humor as a way to sort of break down that awkwardness that children have and that curiosity. And let's kind of get to the root of where you can see me as a big jokester, a big kid, because that's essentially what I am. What I'll do is if I see kids that are staring at me, but aren't, they're being polite, but they're staring at me, I purposely, depending on where I am, I'll purposely kind of walk over and be like, how you doing? Hey, what's going on? If they're doing something, I'm like, oh, so tell me about that. What's this? I'll immediately like, hey, let's take the attention off of what you're focusing on. Let's connect on a human level. And for me, it's all about hopefully equipping them that the next time they interact with somebody that is similar to me, that they kind of removes that stage of like figuring it out. They could just kind of jump into like, oh, that's a person. Because I remember meeting this other person that looked a certain way, and I realized that they're just a person too. But there was that one instance where I remember there was a kid. He was like a little bit of like I probably hate to say this, but I bet you the kid's a jerk right now. I think he's an adult now. This was a few years ago. I bet you he's a jerk because I remember he was like screaming and yelling in a store with his mom. And I'm standing there, just innocent bystander, just watching this kid, and he looks at me like this, and I remember just looking at him, and his mom turned away, and all I did was I looked at him, and I went, ruff. Like I just barked at him. I don't know why. I just barked at him, man. And it freaked him out. He was just like, oh, all of a sudden he stopped being a little brat and he stopped screaming and yelling in the store because now he was terrified. And I felt good about myself, man. But that doesn't happen a lot. I don't want people to think that I'm walking around barking at every kid that I come in contact with. It was only that kid because he was a little bit of a work. He's a little bit of a work.
I'm sure that kid still tells that story today
Oh, I
somewhere.
bet he does. I wonder if he sees me on TV at any point, if he's like, that's the dude that barked at me.
Right. And
Like I
nobody
just,
believes him, right? No one's like, get out of here.
Meanwhile, the kid is scared of dogs. The kid is scared of he's scared of people with any sort of birds. He's terrified now, but yet I'm the one laughing my ass off over here, and the poor kid is traumatized.
Well, tell me about the Rebirth podcast here, JR. What's that all about? And, what kind of type of guests, what do you talk about on the show, and where can we find it?
Yeah, thank you so much, man. I think probably the simplest way of connecting with it is going to my website, jrmartinez.com. Obviously, there's like Instagram at I am JR Martinez, and that's my handle across all channels. But the Rebirth podcast, man, I call it Rebirth. A lot of veterans refer to the day that they were injured as their alive day. I call it my rebirth because I truly believe parts of me died on that day and other parts of me were born on that day. But as over the last 18 and a half years since I was injured, I've discovered that all of us experience rebirths, right? Not to the same capacity that maybe I've experienced, but nonetheless, we all have a phase of our life that dies, right? Whether it's a career that we were in for so long, all of a sudden now the business is no longer there, the title's not there, we switch to another job. Maybe we lose a child, maybe we lose a spouse, we lose a family member. We were married for so many years and now all of a sudden we're divorced. Like, I mean, there's a lot of experiences that all of us have where we have to experience a rebirth, and changes frequently happen, as you know. And so for me, I just wanted to really touch on what I got really uncomfortable with is after dancing, people would essentially kind of just almost, I don't want to say worship the ground I walked on, but sort of elevated me and put me on this pedestal of what I've overcome and what I've accomplished. And I always said to people, there's a lot of people out there that are doing incredible things that have overcome a lot more than I've overcome, or even the same things that are doing kick-ass things. Why are you putting all the attention on me? And so the Rebirth podcast is an opportunity to talk to people from all walks of life, whether they're just people in your community that are doing great things, or celebrities or people you may recognize, and just kind of touching on what was their rebirth. And then you start to find that it's these little small moments that they've experienced over the course of their life that sort of introduce them to, oh man, this is what I could be doing. Oh man, this is what I want to do. And so what that does is that sort of makes it relatable to everybody that's listening to say, oh man, well, I had like a small moment like that too. Maybe I should pay attention to that because maybe it's given me a sign and direction that my life can be X, Y, and Z. So honestly, it's a selfish way for me to have conversation with a variety of people and just learn so much from their life and hopefully apply some of that to my life.
Yeah, and much needed too. And I can relate myself to being a recovering alcoholic and an addict as
There
well.
you
So
go.
there was definitely that moment for me, as well. And I did want to help you. I know that I did want to ask you about the way that you help veterans with homes. I know you have Operation Finally Home. And I've interviewed so many veterans, JR, and it's amazing the community of veterans that are helping one another. And I think it's so
Yeah.
needed. And it's awesome to see so many people stepping up. So what is the Operation Finally Home all about? Where can we find that?
Well, listen, man, as you know, with a lot of the service members that you've spoken to, it's all about service. And for us, even though we're not in a uniform anymore, we're wearing a different uniform, we still want to figure out ways that we can actually kind of, implement and introduce service to a lot of people and still carry that out for ourselves because that's our purpose. And it's the reason we live. It's the reason we do what we do. I've had the opportunity to hear Jason speak and, even being a police officer, right? It's all about service. And even though if you can speak, that's a form of service, right? And so for me, the opportunity to give back to the veteran space and to the family members, whether it's, had working with Operation Finally Home or whether it's have worked with other organizations like Mission 22 or, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America that focus more on the legislative side of things and getting veterans their benefits that, they're entitled to and they deserve and try to get new things passed. Listen, I've paired up with Folds of Honor. You name it, the Travis Manion Foundation, Lone Survivor Foundation. I'm working with a lot of different organizations. For me, all I care about is I look at your finances, making sure the money's going to the programs and not to some deep pocket somewhere else in some high office. And as long as you're focusing on the need that's out there, whether it's home, whether it's mental health, whether it's focusing on the brain, whether it's talking about family services, whatever it may be, that's what I want to support. And so it's a big part of my life. It's essentially philanthropy has been the indicator that has allowed me to tap into the potential of using my voice to impact people. And so I hope people listening right now will say, man, I want to become a part of an organization. I want to support an organization. There are a lot of causes out there. I would tell you to just do some homework, look at people's finances. And if it taps into something that you're passionate about, I say just put your head down and just dive in because you're going to get so much more out of it than maybe what you intended to give to them.
Yeah, I'm going to drop a link in the description of this podcast episode to your podcast as well as the Operation Finally Home. And one of the things
Thank you, man.
I do think, JR, is that people are a little bit cautious about giving their money to these organizations because they don't know where the money is going, and they've heard so many horror stories about the money going in other people's pockets instead of helping the people. So that's why we need honest organizations, because so many people need the help and we need to get it to them. So props to you for that.
Right, man.
The last thing I want to hit you with here, JR, I love to ask all the dads that I get on the podcast, what type of advice do you have for that new dad or for that about to be father who's out there listening?
I would say just be present. And I would say, uh, be present, and I would say don't overwhelm yourself. Don't overwhelm yourself with all this, information that's out there. A lot of it's great, and I get it. It's useful, it's helpful, but don't overwhelm yourself. Just be present, listen to your child, and listen to your own intuition. And we are more equipped and qualified to be parents than we think. And we just have a tendency at times to overwhelm ourselves with all this information of what to do, when not to do it, how to do it. And it's just like we end up overwhelming ourselves with so much information that we do nothing then. And so it's important for us to be like, yeah, pay attention, but just breathe, take it easy, be present, and just listen to yourself and listen to your baby.
Yeah, very well said. I love the message. This has been an honor for me. I got to say, J.R. Martinez, you're a first-class father all the way. And thank you so much for giving me a few minutes of your time here.
Hey,
on First
man, it
Class
was a
Fatherhood.
pleasure. Thank you so much, man. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.